protection from deception, Jesus gives us some very clear warnings. And I'm of the opinion that if Jesus issues a warning, just maybe we should pay attention. So we'll step into Matthew chapter 23, and Jesus is speaking over the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, you who killed the prophets and stoned those sent to you. How often I've longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you'll not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's a very dire prediction Jesus is making over the city. He calls them desolate. It's still a thriving, bustling place, a flourishing city. And Jesus imagines it, understands it to be desolate. And he left the temple and he was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. The disciples are a little bit offended, or at least they're uneasy with the tone of what he's saying. It's not desolate. Herod's temple was one of the wonders of the ancient world. It was the pride of the nation. People came from around the Roman Empire to see it, and so the disciples, trying to change the tone a bit, called Jesus' attention to the buildings. And in verse 2, Jesus said, do you see all these things? I tell you the truth. You know by now when you see that phrase, right? I tell you the truth, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Jesus didn't always just say happy things. In fact, the tone of this whole passage is pretty intense. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, if you leave the Temple Mount and you're going east, you cross the Kidron Valley, and immediately there is the Mount of Olives. So the disciples are there. And the disciples came to Jesus privately. Tell us, when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? The disciples leaped to the conclusion that if the temple's to be destroyed, it's got to be the end of the age. They can't imagine bringing destruction to that massive, spectacular temple unless it's the end of all things. And Jesus answered their question, but he said in verse 4, watch out that no one deceives you. And that's really the text for this little study we will do. Matthew 24 is Jesus' most lengthy prophetic discourse. He's the greatest of all the Hebrew prophets. He's giving them a description of what is in front of them in their lifetime, and then he also describes the world as we approach the end of the age. And in the midst of that rather dire passage, Jesus' most consistent, most repeated warning is against deception. Watch out that no one deceives you. Now, if Jesus is warning us against deception, I think we should all acknowledge that we are vulnerable to being deceived. If you don't believe you can be deceived, I would submit to you humbly, you already are. Same chapter, verse 24, Jesus said, many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Same chapter, verse 11, now verse 24, for false Christ, false messiahs, and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and miracles, deceive even the elect, if that were possible. How you define terms has a great deal of bearing on how you understand what Jesus is saying. If you think of a prophet as someone who wore a long Hebrew-looking robe and had a scruffy beard and said, thus saith the Lord, you might think you're pretty much removed from that. But biblically speaking, one of the ways to understand a prophet is someone who gives God's perspective, someone who tells the truth to the people. A priest represents the people to God. A prophet represents God to the people. So the prophets are the people you expect to tell the truth. So a false prophet is someone you expect to tell you the truth who does not. If you'll tolerate that slightly expanded definition, when Jesus is warning us about many false prophets deceiving many people, it doesn't take a great deal of creative imagination to imagine a time when many people you would expect to tell the truth are not telling the truth. And Christ we attach it to Jesus because we think of Jesus the Christ, but it's really through several languages. It's Jesus the Messiah, Jesus the Anointed One. So he said there'll be many false messiahs, false saviors, people who claim to have solutions. They're going to resolve the problems of human suffering. And they'll say peace when there is no peace. And the outcome of all of this, he said, is many, many will be deceived. Now, I think that's relevant because I don't think it's a real stretch to say we live in a time, in my lifetime at least, of unprecedented manipulation, propaganda, and censorship. Things like the idea of free speech have been completely almost co-opted. And we have all these new labels that are being introduced. We have misinformation. If it's misinformation, you can't say it. That's a very new idea. Once upon a time, we would say, we would defend your right to say the most heinous things in public. But now in the clamping down on freedom, now you're censored. You're canceled. You're shadow banned. The algorithms aren't going to promote what you do. Misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. They keep creating new words to give them greater license. It's bizarre to me. We've turned good into evil and evil into good. It's confusing. It's disorienting. They put pornography in the libraries of our young children in the schools, and we object to the books. They say we're banning books. Not at all. We're saying some learning should be age appropriate. It's the reason we don't sell beer in elementary schools. Well, it's among the many reasons. We don't give out driver's license at daycare. Some learning is age appropriate. It has nothing to do with banning books. But what we see is this manipulation of information. And along with that, technology is providing us unprecedented tools with which we can communicate. From our little church in Middle Tennessee, we share the good news of Jesus with the nations of the world on a weekly basis. It was an impossibility just a few years ago. And the way we're able to do that and the tools we have to communicate with are phenomenal, but they also usher in unprecedented tools for deception. And it makes it increasingly difficult to know the truth. Have you noticed? There's been one institution after another that a few short years ago we considered to be bedrock solid, trustworthy, and stable. And now they seem far less so. And tragically, that includes in many instances even the church. So these same tools that enable us to communicate make it much, much, much easier to brew deception. And the newest one on the horizon, it seems to me, is AI. I certainly know I don't understand yet the full potential of that. I think it'll bring far greater change than the internet has. And while it has amazing potential for positive and good things, it holds a startling potential for deception and manipulation. Again, not to be frightened, Jesus told us it would happen. So he gave us a warning. He said, watch out. Watch out that no one deceives you. And I think to think of it just in terms of politics or to think of it in terms of some of those places that are the more easy, I think the deception that is flourishing around us this week, I can give you a couple examples. This week, the United Methodist Church changed formally their policy. Now, their practice has been aligned with this for quite some time, but they formally changed their policy. It's one of the largest Protestant denominations in our nation. They voted to repeal their ban on the LGBTQ clergy and any prohibitions on its ministers from officiating same-sex weddings. That's a significant deviation from orthodoxy. Under the banner of being inclusive and as an expression of love, they've accepted an expanded definition of marriage. But in so doing, they've set aside the language of Scripture and the orthodox practice of the Christian church over many centuries. I think you can put that in the category of deception. So you can be well-educated, highly sophisticated, use big words, and still be deceived. I'll give you a completely different example. I've seen multiple officials in recent days, very well-informed people, very well-educated, people of great power and significance, look dead into a lens and go, our border is secure. It really isn't funny, it's deception. Somebody in the pile is deceived, because if you have anybody that happens to be on the border, there's hundreds of thousands of people spilling across. It's an invasion. And they're coming from the nations of the world. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. We did a conference last week, and we had heard 2 or 3 presentations on abortion. And one of the things we hear quite frequently is that abortion is protection for those who are pregnant from rape or incest, or to protect the life of a mother. That's why abortion exists. And they say it with such intensity and such ferocity and such frequency. You think, well, that has to be true. That reflects less than 2% of the abortions that are deception. It is flourishing, or it's not something that's coming. We've separated ourselves from the truth. The truth is inconvenient. It's awkward. It has to be grappled with. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to the channel. You know the drill. Hit the bell for notifications. If you want to, leave a comment.